Every day we're reminded about 9/11, but not much is said about the subsequent anthrax attacks, which occurred just weeks later. Now, this week marks the 11th anniversary of the anthrax attacks, which shut down a Senate office building and caused a nationwide panic immediately in the wake of 9/11. 5 people died of inhalation, and 22 more were infected from the deadly spores. Some of the most notable people that received letters with anthrax in them were Senators Tom Daschle, Patrick Leahy, and Russ Feingold, some of the most outspoken opponents to the impending Patriot Act. Several media outlets also received anthrax letters, including The Sun, New York Post, and NBC's Tom Brokaw. Now, the letters that were sent out appeared to be from Muslim terrorists, saying phrases like "death to America," "death to Israel," "Allah is great." However, soon after the attacks occurred, the government acknowledged that al-Qaeda was no longer a suspect because the anthrax was in fact a highly weaponized military grade that could have only come from 2 biodefense facilities in the U.S., Dugway in Utah or Fort Detrick in Maryland. But, of course, that didn't stop the Bush administration from continuing to peddle the propaganda that it was perpetrated by Muslim terrorists. Think for a second about what it was that shifted our focus away from al-Qaeda and onto Iraq. Remember this?
Less than a teaspoon of dry anthrax, a little bit about this amount. This is just about the amount of a teaspoon. Less than a teaspoonful of dry anthrax in an envelope shut down the United States Senate. Iraq declared 8,500 liters of anthrax. But UNSCOM estimates that Saddam Hussein could have produced 25,000 liters. It should come as no shock then that since Saddam Hussein forced out the last inspectors in 1998, we have amassed much intelligence indicating that Iraq is continuing to make these weapons. We know that Iraq has at least 7 of these mobile biological agent factories.
Oh yeah, all those mobile weapons labs that just didn't exist, huh? Yep. It was the anthrax attacks that really tied Saddam to 9/11, laying out the justification for a preemptive invasion of the country. Also, ABC News reported that anonymous high-level government sources were saying that the bentonite in the anthrax directly tied to Saddam's mobile weapons labs. And John McCain went on David Letterman to ratchet up the fear and further perpetuate that lie.
The second phase is Iraq. There is some indication, and I don't have the conclusions, but some of this anthrax may, and I emphasize may, have come from Iraq.
Oh, is that right?
If that may be the case, then that's when some tough decisions are going to have to be made.
And tough decisions were made, weren't they, McCain? Okay, so the Bush administration knew that the anthrax attacks were an inside job at this point, and that the strain could have only come from their bases. But they never held a public press conference apologizing to the American people for promoting such a dangerously false narrative about Muslim terrorists being responsible. And even worse, that Saddam Hussein was somehow involved. So, who was responsible? Well, for years after the anthrax attacks, the FBI's main suspect was Stephen Hatfill, a member of the government that helped develop a biological weapons facility at Fort Detrick, Maryland. But instead of pursuing a criminal investigation based on actual evidence against him, the FBI began a witch hunt, surveilling, harassing, and stalking him for 5 years. In one interview, Hatfill said that he contemplated suicide multiple times, but that he knew if he did that, he would be guilty in the court of public opinion, and he couldn't let them do that to him. Well, after 5 years of this harassment, Hatfill was awarded a hefty $5.8 million settlement from the government to say, hey, sorry, dude, we ruined your life by telling everyone that you were the anthrax perpetrator. Sorry about that. The next suspect was Bruce Ivins, a top anthrax researcher at Fort Detrick for 18 years. He was working on vaccinations for anthrax and also helped the anthrax investigation. Interestingly, Hatfill, along with other anthrax experts, came out in Ivins' defense, saying that he wouldn't have been able to weaponize the anthrax undetected. The process is an extremely complicated one that takes hours in a special lab. Well, during the investigation, the FBI tried to bribe Ivins' son with $2.5 million to rat his father out, and also attempted to turn his hospitalized daughter against him by showing her photos of dead anthrax victims. Wow, really going for the jugular there. And then Bruce Ivins died. He's alleged to have killed himself by overdosing on Tylenol, which was one of the most painful ways that someone could choose to kill themselves, considering how it takes 2 full days for your liver to toxify if otherwise healthy. Now, after Ivans died, the FBI held a press conference saying that they would soon present the case against Ivans. But to this day, we're still waiting for that evidence. Needless to say, some lingering questions remain about the anthrax attacks. So let's continue to ask them. Directly after the nation was in a paralyzed state of fear from the attacks of 9/11, the anthrax attacks happened. Terrorism was no longer localized. It was now something that could happen to anyone, anywhere. Now, 11 years on, and with the main suspect dead, the case is closed. Or is it? Do we really know the truth? And why are these attacks significant? To help me break it all down, I'm joined by Robbie Martin, journalist for MediaRoots.org. Hey, Robbie, thanks for coming on.
Hey, Abby, how you doing?
Good. So, Robbie, we hear almost every day still by the media and political establishment, 9/11, the threat of terrorism. We don't hear that much about the anthrax attacks anymore. Why is this, and why were they so significant, and what did they really do to the American psyche?
Well, 9/11 was an isolated incident, and, it happened in New York City. It affected 3,000 people and a lot more lives, as repercussions from that. But the anthrax attacks took it out of a localized, isolated incident and made people feel as if they could be attacked in their own homes. Someone who lives in a remote area in the mountains could be sent a letter with anthrax in it. And basically you have the idea of terrorism escalated to the point where it could come at any time to anyone, basically.
Yeah, and that really did preempt, as I said before, the whole Iraq invasion, the biological weapons, the duct tape on the windows. Better duct tape your windows, otherwise, the biological weapons are going to come in your home, as if that would protect you anyway. But based on the evidence that we know, Robbie, about the anthrax attacks that the government has admitted, that the media has uncovered, what is the best case scenario, looking at what we already know, to have really happened?
Well, the best case scenario isn't that good, and that's the disturbing part. The best case scenario is that the people in power during the Bush administration, who wanted to push through the Iraq war, used the fear levels at the time to basically plant the seeds for the propaganda of the Iraq war by leaking to the press through ABC, through the Wall Street Journal. John McCain went on David Letterman, talking about how the anthrax came from Saddam Hussein's supposed biological weapons program.
So the best case scenario is that they used it to ratchet up the fear, to really get everyone on board with the Iraq invasion and using that threat. And they never really did come out and say that the anthrax was not the Muslim terrorists that they said. It just kind of went under the radar, Robbie. But now that we know that members of the Bush administration were on CIPRO, and also the targeted members that voted, that were in opposition to the Patriot Act, what do you think the worst case scenario is now that we know these kind of damning facts?
Oh, the worst case scenario is that, the motives are questionable. Why would someone who's a terrorist, who wanted to, a Muslim terrorist, why would they want to send anthrax letters to people who are opposing the Patriot Act? You have to wonder, I can only speculate what the worst case scenario is, but someone who sent those letters wanted to shut down the Senate. They wanted to get the Patriot Act passed, and they wanted to ratchet up the levels of fear so high that people would feel as if terrorist attacks will continue, and that 9/11 was not a singular event, that it would continue indefinitely.
And who benefited, though? If this is so, if it really was a conspiracy or just a cover-up, at the highest levels of government, who did benefit from the anthrax attacks?
Well, the people who were behind PNAC benefited immensely from it. They got their dream. They were able to invade Iraq essentially based off of the idea that Saddam was behind the anthrax attacks. The term WMDs became a household term because of the anthrax attacks. Colin Powell wouldn't have been able to go to the UN and hold up that vial and convince all of them, or I don't know if they were convinced, but he managed to make the case at the time that Iraq was a threat. And not, and another side of it completely is that it restarted a bioweapons arms race that went in the face of a treaty that was ratified in, I think, the early 70s, banning bioweapon development. And now, since 9/11, we have $50 billion being poured into this new biodefense industry. And who knows how many people are making weaponized anthrax now, because now private industry, the private sector, is making and weaponizing anthrax on behalf of the government.
Great point, Robbie. It's really something to take into account, is that other side of the profit-making industry about this. But Ivins is dead. Bruce Ivins is dead. Case is closed. The FBI said that they would present their case against Ivins. Have they done that? And is there any evidence really against Ivins here?
I mean, the evidence is flimsy at best. I mean, right after he, supposedly committed suicide, the FBI went and did a press conference presenting their case to the American public. And, the guy who presented this case, he's sweating, he's stuttering while the press is asking him questions. And the best evidence they came up with is that Bruce Ivins had a history of mental illness. Well, I'm sorry, but 1 in 5 Americans suffers from mental illness. That's statistically shown. So that's not proof of his guilt. That's a smear campaign. And then on top of that, the physical evidence they say that they have is a flask that was found in his home that contained anthrax spores, the same spores that were at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Well, if you work with anthrax and you're a bioweapons lab technician, I mean, the chances of you having traces of the same spores that you're working with at your place of employment at home are pretty likely. That still has no bearing on his guilt or anything like that. It's completely baseless.
It is definitely baseless, Robbie. We haven't seen that evidence yet. And, like Obama said, the case is closed. Thank you so much for coming on, breaking it all down. I know you've been researching this for a while. Robbie Martin, MediaRoots.org. So what motives would Ivins have to send anthrax to the most vocal opponents of the Patriot Act? Or why were members of the Bush administration and the press on Cipro, the anthrax antibiotic, before the attacks occurred? Why weren't the people who died and were infected important enough to also be warned to take Cipro when it could have saved their lives? Most importantly, with so many unsolved mysteries, why did Obama not only order the investigation to end, but threaten to veto any more funding to examine the truth? That's the question we should all be asking.